Hi everyone, welcome. I'm preparing to check in on a couple of my systems, a couple systems that only during the last check-in 13 days ago were buddied up to become buddy bins. And 13 days ago, if you do some quick math in your head, you'll see that the systems were 120 and 60 days of age. So the older system was 120, the younger one was 60. So basically this older bin was exactly twice the age of the younger one. And it was at that point that we decided, hey, why don't we buddy these systems up? Even though there's a 60-day gap in their ages, it seemed like since they're both red wigglers, they both have similar sized populations despite the difference in their ages, they seem like a good pair of bins to be buddied up. So sort of like last week when their age relationship was exactly double, today after we get done feeding them their 12th and their 6th feedings, the relationship between how many feedings have been applied so far will be double. And as you can see, the estimated worm count in these bins is pretty much the same. There's only a few dozen difference. And I guess once you get in that 3,000 range, a few dozen is a very marginal difference. The systems are not covered the same, even though when I'm running buddy bins or sister bins or twin bins or whatever you want to refer to them as, I do try to manage them very similarly, right down to the way they're being covered, to the way they're being fed, and things like that. But since last week was not last week, 13 days ago was the first time we had started into the buddying up, the only thing that we did consistent between the two systems was feed them in almost the same exact way. And feeding them last time consisted of giving them a couple of coffee filters, kind of like what you see in here already. Each system's got 2 coffee filters. And then the 2 coffee filters on top are actually feeding zone indicators. And I don't even know where the second one is. Yeah, they're still here, piled on top of each other. But as to be expected, when there's plastic coverings and a lot of moisture recirculating, the very top surface of the material gets nice and damp, whereas material covered in only paper and cardboard tends to get a little bit dry. I mean, it's not totally dry, but it's dry enough to ward off, worm traffic. So I believe what we've got here is perhaps the remains of one of the coffee filters, fairly at the end point already, and the second one is holding up pretty good. I've got replacements for these feeding zone indicators. The coffee filters that I place over the feedings are treated as feeding zone indicators, and as you can see, I've got 2 more coffee filters in here. So I'm just going to recycle these coffee filters to become bedding as part of our feeding today, and then we'll swap out the feeding zone indicators with nice new ones. And I guess we're also at that point where we can decide whether or not we want to stick with plastic coverings on the younger system, or if we want to switch over to a more breathable paper-based covering. I'll usually do that based on how much moisture I perceive within the material. And if it starts to feel like things are getting perhaps a little bit too damp or muddy, that's when I'll usually decide to eliminate the plastic coverings and opt for a somewhat more breathable top covering. But last time too, we decided let's just stick with what's working here. Just because we've buddied the systems up, we don't want to try to force anything for the sake of consistency or matching things up. We're still going to stick to whatever works as far as top coverings are concerned. Sort of like what happened to one of those 2 feeding zone indicators that were on top here. The 2 coffee filters that got applied with the feeding last time seem to be gone down here in the feeding zone. So besides the coffee filters out on top, we had taken 2 of these coffee filters and placed them into each bin, and then we placed lettuce into that. So 13 days later, lettuce is not going to show up as leftovers. Very unlikely if we see any of that, especially if the surrounding bedding material, the coffee filters that the lettuce was placed into, is gone already too. Then the food itself is certainly going to be gone. But there's other types of foods that don't go quite as quick, such as corn cobs, obviously. And these corn cobs have been in here for I don't know how long, definitely a few check-ins. And something I usually do with corn cobs is just not interfere with the breakdown process and just try to observe how long it takes for them to get broken down. I've been doing it that way for a couple years now, so I think I'm just going to stick to that. But I don't know, one of these days I might opt to change my mode of operating when it comes to the corn cobs. Perhaps I'll start doing what I see other people do, which is just crumble them up once they become fragile enough to be crumbled up. I guess the cool thing about having two systems that do have almost 2 months difference in their ages, 60 days difference in their ages, is having the opportunity to compare one bin, such as the one I'm probing around in right now, being 60 days older than the younger bin, clearly shows signs of being much more further along as far as just the fineness of the material and the overall progress of the bin. And we spotted that last time too. It's a pretty obvious thing. 60 days in a worm bin is a pretty good amount of time to see some good progress. I'm just kind of probing through here to see if I could sense any other larger objects. One way or another, when these systems were being managed independently of each other, that system received a number of corn cobs, whereas this one seems to only have one, which seems unusual. I figured I would probably bump into more, but perhaps that's all there is in here. Alright, so now the foods that they're getting, as you saw earlier, are a variety of different things. We've got not only the coffee, which I'll definitely sprinkle in at the end, I believe, but we've got banana peel and we've got potato peel. So, as I usually do, I'll typically drop a little bit of bedding down into the feeding area before I apply the foods, and we'll do that again here today. Besides doing what we mentioned earlier, which is reusing these old feeding zone indicators as bedding down in the feeding areas, I've also got my prepared bedding, so we could be generous. And you know, this one damp one from the older bin, or I mean from the younger bin, we can sort of just tear that one in half and spread it around a little bit. This way we've already started out with an equal amount of bedding material at the bottom of each feeding zone. But I've also got soiled napkins and paper towels and stuff like that down here that I'd like to include in the feeding. So here is a napkin, soiled napkin. This is also a napkin, but it's one of those somewhat more robust, thicker ones, a little bit more substantial. So that's part of what we're going to be feeding them today, but we're also going to supplement that with a little bit of my prepared bedding here. This stuff gets prepared as a combination of different materials. Nothing fancy, but there's cardboard shreds as well as paper shreds in here. And then I sprinkle in fine little particle matter of leaves, dry leaves from what I collected in the autumn time that I've still got quite a bit left over of. And then I dampen the whole thing and I cover it so that it has a chance to sort of soak and become nice and aged and ready for use by the time I get around to applying it to my worm bins. So that's a pretty generous portion of bedding, and like I'll usually do, I'll return any fragments that we encountered along the way back down into the feeding area. And I'm tempted, you know, I've been thinking maybe I would start crumbling these corn cobs if it was possible to do so. However, I don't know if it is possible to do so. I guess we could try with one of them. It does seem like this one's going to give pretty easily. There we go. And it's always that inner core of the corn cob that the worms seem most interested in the beginning. I assume it's because that stuff is pretty tender and soft and easier for them to eat. A little bit more so than the surrounding fibrous materials that make up the rest of the corn cob. So we need not break it apart into tiny fragments. I just wanted to reveal its inside so we could check it out. But I think we can get down to the business of applying today's feeding. I've also got this one very oily piece of paper towel here that I wanted to treat a little differently from the rest of the paper products that we placed down underneath the feeding area. That one was placed into a container that I was putting fried French fries into. So French fries, I don't know if they've got other names in certain places. I think some places call them chips maybe. French fries, they're basically, you know, strips of potato that are either deep fried or baked sometimes. Usually the French fries around here get baked or placed into the air fryer, but yesterday, just for a change of pace, I fried them in oil. And then after doing so, I placed them onto this piece of paper to allow them to have somewhere for their, you know, drippings to go. And I thought that perhaps we could place that piece of paper, since it is kind of oily. I wasn't sure if the worms would respond to it in a positive way or if they would reject it due to the oiliness of it. So I thought I would place it underneath the plastic covering. And I guess we are going to just stick to using the plastic covering in the younger of the two bins, just for, you know, sticking with what doesn't need to change right away. And eventually we'll probably end up with coverings that are a little bit more consistent. I mean, as I was checking through the older of the two bins here, I even felt like the material in here might be a little bit dry, almost making me question whether paper coverings are still the right solution in here, or maybe it is time to start protecting against any further drying by also placing plastic coverings onto the older of the two bins also. For me, summertime is pretty humid here in the state of New Jersey in the United States, and the humidity in the air prevents material from drying, and that leaves my systems a little bit more damp than in the winter, whereas in the winter things are much more dry because of my climate control system sucking the moisture out of materials. So, you know, I want to just be able to remain flexible and adapt to whatever the bins need, and not get, you know, sort of sucked into some sort of a routine that's not optimal. So that's it for my worm chow. That stuff that I was sprinkling in before the worm chow, that was pulverized eggshell, and that's something that the worms utilize in order to break down the foods that they're consuming. So when we're done, we'll place these feeding zone indicators over the feeding zones to show us where we last fed, and then we can restore all the different coverings that we're using here. So I guess after we've sort of tilled around and examined the outskirts of both bins, I'll have a better sense as to whether we want to stick with paper and cardboard coverings in the older of the two bins, or if perhaps replacing them with plastic might be a good idea to prevent any further loss of moisture to evaporation, because the stuff all crumbles and I really like it that way, but I also don't want to allow things to go to any sort of an extreme in terms of becoming too dry. And I suppose if the stuff were becoming too dry, then the first sign of trouble would be the fact that it would be devoid of any worm traffic. So even though the stuff is crumbling quite nicely and is loose and flowing the way I like it, there's still a good number of worms hanging out in this stuff, telling me that perhaps there's no reason to worry. I think it was just that the crumbly and flowing nature of it in itself was what I was starting to perceive as a possible sign that things might be becoming a bit dry, but I don't think that's the case. So I think we're going to be safe, continuing on for at least one more interval between feedings with the existing coverings. And then at some point we might harmonize things and have both systems utilizing a common type of top covering, but I don't want to feel like I'm trying to conform to something that's somewhat irrelevant and then disregard the needs of the systems. I'd always want to put the needs of the worms ahead of any sort of weird compulsion to drive consistency. Even though I guess my disposition towards, or my tendency towards kind of a OCD-ish behavior would often compel me to try to drive consistency. I'm going to resist the urge to try to make that happen, and I think we're just going to go back on with the coverings that we started with, and I think that's going to continue to work nicely because no matter where I look, the material flows nicely, but it's also at the same time holding on to a nice moisture level that I think the worms appreciate because they're in all the stuff everywhere. No matter where you look, there's worms everywhere. So we're back down to 1 feeding zone indicator in each system, and then in the younger system we're going to go back on with the plastic just the way we found it, and in the older system, ditto, right back on with what we found when we got here. Alright everyone, that's it for our check-in with our red wiggler buddy bins, buddied up only now for the past 13 days, and I think they're going to work well as a buddied up pair of systems. You know, having that 30-day difference in their ages, I think adds a little bit of a kind of an interesting twist. Usually my buddy bins are my sister bins and twin bins. I guess sister bins, twin bins imply that they're probably similar or close in age, but buddy bins like this with a pretty wide gap in their age differences I think is an interesting thing to see, so you can do a little bit of compare and contrast. Alright everyone, that's it for the check-in. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I got a few things I got to take care of getting cleaned up and put away, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. Before I go really quick, let me say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now. Oops, almost forgot. I want to test this oily piece of paper underneath the plastic to see if it gets soaked, if it draws worm traffic, or if by being oily it gets rejected by the worms. So we'll have to see. Thanks again folks. Bye now.